The second major section of my book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know, is on American foreign policy towards Israel and the bipartisan consensus of unconditional aid to Israel with absolutely no red lines whatsoever. And there is nothing subjected to more censorship inside of America than criticism of the Israeli government. So, to challenge that foreign policy consensus could mean an end to an academic or a journalist or a politician's entire career, which has had an incredible chilling effect on any criticism of the Israeli government. So I start off the Israel policy section by discussing what happened to Katie Halper. She was a longtime contributor to a political commentary show, but she was fired because she made a segment about why Israel is considered an apartheid state. And she was still fired even though she had based her entire segment off of the United Nations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, Israeli ministers, and even South African government officials comparing the Israeli situation to South African apartheid. Despite all that context, she was told that The Hill had a policy where they do not allow op-eds, written or video, on Israel. And she is not alone in the censorship of journalists. There are also journalists who were fired by The Guardian and fired by CNN for criticizing the Israeli government. There are even journalists that were assassinated by the Israeli government for criticizing them. And the censorship extends far beyond just journalism. Representative Ilhan Omar was actually removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee for the specific reason that she did not unconditionally support Israel. And the former head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, had a Harvard job rescinded specifically because of his criticism of Israel. And nearly 2/3 of American states have laws which restrict the right of normal Americans or American businesses from supporting the boycott, divestment, sanction movement against Israeli apartheid, meaning that the American government is actually trying to make it illegal for the United States citizens to oppose apartheid. But because of the widespread censorship and media blackout on criticism of Israel, most Americans do not even know why Israel is considered an apartheid state. So I wrote the chapter Why Israel is Considered an Apartheid State in my book to describe the conclusions of the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch as they found that Israel is committing apartheid. Their findings were based on two international laws. Article 7 of the Rome Statute, which says, quote, "Inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intent of maintaining that regime." The next law is the Apartheid Convention, which described apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And all three organizations, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations Office of Human Rights, and Amnesty International, all found that the Israeli government is guilty of committing the crime against humanity of apartheid based on those two laws. So on page 84 of my book, I wrote a short synopsis of what those organizations found. They all investigated and concluded that Israel was guilty of forced family separations, home demolitions, illegal settlement construction, draconian movement restrictions, denial of refugees' right to return, the forcible transfer, administrative detention, torture, and unlawful killings of Palestinians, forced relocation and displacement, illegal blockades, and institutionalized discrimination, all with the intent to dominate the Palestinian people. Those investigations found the fragmentation of the Palestinian population into 4 separate classes entitled to different levels of rights and subjected to different levels of restrictions as one of the most important aspects of the Israeli apartheid occupation of Palestine. So that is why when I first published this paper in February 2023, it was the global consensus of the world's leading human rights organizations that Israel was committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. But still, that global consensus was not enough to stop the unconditional support of the American government for the Israeli government. So, in July 2023, I wrote Rethinking America's Relationship with Israel, in which I advocated for conditional support for Israel rather than unconditional support for Israel. So on page 97 of my book, I wrote, I don't want my country supporting apartheid. The first step is determining the truth of the matter. The Biden administration needs to direct the State Department to investigate the claims made by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations. I then advocated for the United States to treat Israeli apartheid the same way we did South African apartheid. In 1986, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which applied temporary sanctions on the apartheid government, which were lifted once the apartheid system was ended. And I advocated for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to push for the same type of sanctions to be applied to the Israeli government until Israel stopped committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. Needless to say, the investigation never took place and the sanctions were never created. But there's also one more change I advocated for, and that was for the United States to stop shielding Israel from international scrutiny. America needs to just abstain from United Nations resolutions condemning Israel. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So the next paper I wrote was on October 10th, 3 days after the Hamas terrorist attacks, which killed almost 1,000 Israelis. What Hamas did on October 7th is absolutely unacceptable. No attacks on civilians are ever justified under any circumstances. And what I wrote on October 10th is this. There's a long history of war in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and even in times of relative peace, thousands of people still die. Both Israelis and Palestinians have legitimate reasons to despise each other. The annihilation of the other side is a mainstream sentiment in both populations. Ideologies of evil have taken over. It is not uncommon to hear truly vile language insinuating that the other side are somehow less than human or that they should be eradicated. If that is acceptable language in your culture needs to change. Israeli suffering is suffering. Palestinian suffering is suffering. Both sides are made up of human beings deserving of human rights and fair treatment. There needs to be a cultural renaissance in the region. Mutual respect for human life, empathy, compassion, tolerance, interdependence, and personal connections are the bedrock of peaceful coexistence. One way or another, this war will end diplomatically. The question is whether that happens before or after widespread atrocities and loss of life. I then went on to say, our best minds need to be devoted to peaceful negotiations. People within this conflict itself, as well as those foreign leaders closely involved, must choose diplomacy instead of death and destruction. I want people to stop dying and suffering. I want the pro-peace factions of both populations to unite against the pro-war factions. War is the ultimate enemy of humankind, and if you're going to fight against anything, fight against war itself. And I truly wish the international community had heeded my message at the time, because thousands of people have died since then, and I don't know if peace has ever been further from reach than right now. So the next paper that I wrote was on October 28th, 3 weeks after the Hamas terrorist attack, which killed almost 1,000 Israelis. In retaliation, the Israeli government killed over 7,000 Palestinians, including nearly 3,000 children. The Biden administration said to expect more Palestinian civilian casualties, and Congress promised unconditional support for Israel. The Israeli government also announced plans to use their apartheid blockade to cut off food, water, fuel, and medicine to the entire civilian population of Gaza, which included over 2.3 million civilians, alongside the Hamas terrorists, which numbered in the tens of thousands, which is a war crime called collective punishment. Another war crime the Israeli government was committing was indiscriminate bombing, with Israeli leaders saying that their emphasis was on damage and not accuracy. So instead of legitimate military targets, the Israeli government had already destroyed nearly half of all residential buildings in northern Gaza in the first 3 weeks of the war. The IDF had also attacked numerous mosques, churches, healthcare facilities, designated safe zones, evacuation routes, and Palestinian civilian convoys fleeing for their lives. At least 53 UN officials had been killed by Israeli airstrikes, and at least 24 journalists were killed. And that was all with the unconditional backing of the United States government. And instead of pushing Israel to avoid mass civilian casualties, the Biden administration vetoed a UN resolution condemning all violence against civilians in the Israel-Hamas war. When asked about the mass civilian casualties, Joe Biden said, "I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war." And when a Biden administration official was asked if Joe Biden's comments were too harsh, they responded, "Being honest about the fact that there have been civilian casualties and that there likely will be more is being honest, because that's what war is. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's messy." So I had a very simple plea for the Biden administration all the way back on October 28th. I said, in my view, the US government could stop this war with 2 small but significant changes. Condition US aid to Israel and stop ignoring the wrongs Israel commits. Congress should start with no war crimes and no crimes against humanity conditions on all foreign aid. America could truly stand up for peace, diplomacy, and Western democratic values. I want people to stop suffering and dying. My ultimate enemy is the war itself. This war is a policy choice of the United States government. Unconditional aid to Israel is the wrong policy. Every day, every hour, every minute, every second, we have the power to make different choices. Our choices could lead to a mutual respect and a lasting peace, or they will continue down a path of mutual disdain and an endless cycle of violence. American foreign policy enables the endless violence. We need to choose peace instead. But my message was still not heard. At that point, the Israeli government had killed nearly 14,000 Palestinians. The vast majority were women and children. So Bernie Sanders advocated for the United States government to enforce the Leahy laws. The Leahy law are provisions in American law which prohibit the U.S. government from using funds to go to foreign security forces when there is credible evidence that those forces are committing gross violations of human rights. Sadly, instead of enforcing the Leahy law, the Biden administration chose to veto a resolution at the United Nations backed by over 100 nations which demanded an immediate ceasefire in the Israeli-Hamas war. That was at a time when the indiscriminate bombing of the Israeli government forced the displacement of 1.9 million people in Gaza, which was about 85% of their population. Additionally, the World Food Program had reported that 9 out of 10 people in Gaza were unable to eat every day because of the siege that the Israeli government had been conducting. And instead of enforcing human rights conditions on American aid to Israel, Biden actually tried to expand Israeli access to American weapons. And even though Joe Biden said it was a worthwhile thought to condition U.S. aid to Israel, then John Kirby, a Biden administration official, said there are no red lines for American aid to Israel, which was really troubling at the time because the Israeli government had said that they planned to roll out the Gaza Nakba, and a plan to get the United States to financially support permanent refugee structures that would be constructed in the Egyptian desert were leaked out, meaning Israel's ethnic cleansing plot for Gaza was in plain sight in December. That leak also came alongside reporting that Netanyahu had tasked his top advisor with creating a plan to thin the Gaza Strip population to a minimum, which happened months after Netanyahu gave a speech at the UN with a map titled The New Middle East, where the Israeli government was in control of the territory from the river to the sea, with absolutely no mention of Palestinians. And that coincides with Netanyahu's long-term stated position of complete opposition to Palestinian statehood, which takes us back to how this war even began. Because for multiple years, Netanyahu said that he was propping up Hamas because they are the more violent alternative to other Palestinian leaders, and that would keep the Palestinians divided amongst themselves, which he thought would help prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. But then a few other details were also revealed, like the New York Times reporting that the Israeli government had detailed Hamas battle plans more than a year before the attack, and they followed those plans with a shocking precision. Also, an Egyptian intelligence officer told the Associated Press that Cairo had repeatedly warned the Israelis that something big was being planned from Gaza. And days before the attack, Israeli intelligence saw signs of Hamas activity in Gaza that suggested the militant group could have been preparing for an attack, yet Israeli forces were never put on high alert. Israeli military officers were actually pulled away from the southern border and directed to the West Bank to protect illegal settlement construction. Then on October 7th, when Hamas breached Israeli territory, it took the Israeli military hours to respond to the attacks. And when they did respond, there were reports of friendly fire from the Israeli government on their own civilians. So it's important to ask, if the Israeli government had every possible opportunity to prevent this attack that any government could hope for, such as detailed enemy plans, warnings from your foreign neighbors, warnings from your own military, why did this attack happen at all? How was it allowed to occur? Because that seems to be the biggest intelligence failure in the history of modern warfare. But it does make sense as a justification for Israel's long-term ethnic cleansing plots that Netanyahu even presented a map at the United Nations for a few months before the war. Which is why one of the main outcomes of this war has to be a thorough investigation into the intelligence failure of October 7th and holding Benjamin Netanyahu responsible for war crimes. He must be tried as a war criminal. All war criminals must be held accountable for their war crimes. But inside of America, the Israel lobby, mainly AIPAC, has said that they will commit to spending $100 million in the 2024 election cycle to make sure nobody who supports human rights conditions on U.S. aid to Israel will be elected. And politicians like Ron DeSantis have called for strict enforcement of anti-BDS laws to restrict the right of Americans to oppose Israeli war crimes or crimes against humanity. And many pro-peace, anti-war crimes protests have been inaccurately represented as pro-Hamas protests, specifically because American media is attempting to mislead the public into unintentional support for genocide. So, one of the main things that could help in this conflict is ending the era of censorship and bring back debate across party lines. I think what would help is having Bill Maher host people like Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, Katie Halper, Ken Roth, or myself to talk about this conflict, to get the actual left-wing progressive view that war crimes do not justify war crimes, and America should be unconditionally opposed to war crimes rather than being unconditionally supportive of Israel. So if you want to check out all the papers that I've written and get my full views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, check out my new book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know, available on Amazon.